I know it's been a while since I made a video. There's just been a lot on my mind lately, and I'm sure you all can relate. With all the geopolitical unrest, this unjust invasion of Ukraine, COVID, runaway inflation, gridlock in Washington, Florida, just Florida. It's a lot. But I'll get off my soapbox, just bar soap, of course, and get to it. If there was ever a time for the globe to take a left hook to the face and pause for a second, now might be that time. The world is facing the expansion of a brutal ground war in Europe, instigated by a nation who derives nearly 60% of its export revenue and about a third of its GDP from oil and gas sales. It's crystal clear that a global transition to energy independence with sustainable energy is a here and now problem, not a once and future one. And to hammer that point home, the latest IPCC report has fortunately just been released. Now, this is the third video I've made about the IPCC. The first two I'll link up here. But in general, my goal of these videos is to put these reports in context, to explain who constitutes the IPCC scientists, where they get their data from, what their goals are, and who signs off on the final language in the reports. These are huge undertakings, and the second working group has published a masterwork in synthesizing the complex social, ecological, and economic impacts of a changing climate. So on February 27th of 2022, Working Group 2 published their own report, Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability, in this sixth assessment cycle, building on the basic science from Working Group 1 to explicitly recognize, I'll just read this paragraph, recognize the interdependence of climate, ecosystems, and biodiversity and human societies, and integrates knowledge more strongly across the natural, ecological, social, and economic sciences than earlier IPCC assessments. The assessment of climate change impacts and risks, as well as adaptation, is set against concurrently unfolding non-climatic global trends, like biodiversity loss, overall unsustainable consumption of natural resources, land and ecosystem degradation, rapid urbanization, human demographic shifts, social and economic inequalities, and a pandemic. That's just the second paragraph. But seriously, I don't just want to summarize this entire report because there's a lot in there, and most of the stuff you probably already have some idea as to what the findings are. But this report states, like Jordan Peterson tried to say,
climate is about everything. So, okay. But your models aren't based on everything.
But more precisely, this graphic, for example, summarizes key relationships and interactions among human beings, our environment, and a changing climate. Ecosystems don't adapt in a vacuum, and our actions are the most influential factors on both the climate and those ecosystems, and there are feedback loops everywhere. What this report does so well is talk about risk management. We can accept reality and transition our lifestyles, culture, and values to foster motivation to mitigate climate change, adapt to warming temperatures and higher sea levels, yet still enjoy food abundance and clean water, and conserve the environment for ecosystems to flourish. We can still prevent the worst outcomes, not eliminate them altogether, by appropriately understanding the risks and adapting. And if there's one key word to summarize this report, I think it is adaptation. Not Armageddon, not avoidance, not acceptance, but adaptation. How much adapting we need to do really depends on how much we get our act together today, how much we can curb carbon emissions and frankly conserve the natural resources we have before critical tipping points are reached and we live in a Mad Max level of tribal desperation. Our future could be one filled with wet bulb temperatures that cause millions of excess deaths every year, where droughts and floods cause whole countries to migrate, disrupting resources and energy grids, creating geopolitical unrest and global competition and antagonism. Wait a minute, I know it sounds familiar, but as much as that future may be becoming more and more like the present, this report helps to remind us that climate change will only exacerbate the worst instincts of humanity. Like the other reports, it supports with evidence and degrees of confidence how much climate change will sneak its nasty tentacles into every aspect of our lives. But what it emphasizes is how adaptation, starting today, will help us avoid the worst case scenarios. This paragraph is important because it shows here that there are, quote, feasible and effective adaptation options which can reduce risks to people and nature. Okay, that's great. So what are some of those risks and how do we respond? Well, I'll highlight a few from this report, but before I do, please hit that like button if you're finding this summary helpful. One of the most important are the risks to human health, not just protecting against extreme weather events and temperatures, but also investigating new pathogens and exposures as the climate changes. Notably, mental health, specifically in the context of climate change-related anxiety and depression, is directly addressed in this report for the first time. improving surveillance programs and expanding environmental public health resources is critical. There are water-related risks as well. We'll need to move urban centers farther inland, improve soil management and water conservation, and improve flooding warning systems and more. On food, we'll have to cultivate variants that are survivable in a warmer and wetter world, stress sustainable fishing practices, use natural means to achieve and protect crop yields globally, promote plant-based, nutrient-rich food sources, and be mindful of pollination and microbial biodiversity and new foodborne pathogens. Regarding forests, we have to conserve, protect, and restore. Diversify tree species and adjust composition to resist wildfires and diseases, expand carbon sinks, and incorporate the expertise and collaboration of indigenous peoples. Ocean ecosystems. We have to reduce non-climatic stressors, plan for disruptions in species distribution and community composition, and improve surveillance as temperatures rise, improve assessments of at-risk species and vulnerable areas, and preserve unique aquatic habitats. Now, urban planning was a major focus of this report, and this includes a lot of stuff like basic services, infrastructure, and livelihood diversification and employment, strengthen local and regional food systems, improve community-based health in marginalized and low-income areas, improve sewage, flood control, and landslide prevention, implement sustainable building practices, foster a streamlined urban to rural transition, and promote effective government, civil, and private sector collaboration, especially to enhance the adaptive capacity of vulnerable people. Sea levels also pose a severe but distinctive challenge to city planning, based on the rate, complexity, and costs. We must respond to sea level rise and land subsidence in low-lying settlements and plan for relocation and advanced protective measures. Now, if you made it this far, the word of the day is subsidence, which means a collapse or caving in of a surface or land area. Time to look it up. But it's already happening in parts of Florida, like the tragic Surfside condo collapse in June of last year that killed almost 100 people. Now, what about the most vulnerable populations? So this report paints in stark focus the asymmetry of climate risk. Financially supporting the 3.4 billion people living in rural areas most at risk of climate adversity is paramount. They mention that cash transfers of public works programs can actually be highly effective and feasible ways to increase resilience to climate change. Now, the scientists also take a moment to pause and recognize that a lot of these adaptations are fundamentally limited or constrained by, and I quote, institutional, financial, and technological access and capacity, and depends on coordinated and contextually appropriate responses across physical, natural, and social infrastructure with high confidence. Basically, this won't be easy, and it'll take a lot of coordinated effort and cooperation. They also use the terms soft and hard limits to delineate areas where there is still hope at maintaining general ecosystem stability, those are the soft limits, or where tipping points have already been reached, or the rate of change will outpace our adaptive mechanisms, those are hard limits. Some low-lying coastal areas, polar and mountain regions, and coral reef ecosystems you can see in this chart, for example, have already passed hard limits that are tragically in an unavoidable death spiral even today. Crossing these thresholds is due to maladaptation, or a failure to appropriately assess risk, foster collaboration, and take the necessary steps to mitigate those risks. Lord knows we've done plenty of maladaptation already. Of course, the costs of all this is a major sticking point. Projected estimates of global aggregate net economic damages generally increase non-linearly with global warming levels, with high confidence. Now, despite a high degree of divergence and variability across many of the economic forecasts, most agree that staying under 1.5 degrees centigrade is an important threshold that avoids most of the worst projections and costliest scenarios. That's our hard limit, which has not yet been reached, but will by the middle of this century. Greater details on the cost of climate change weighed against the cost of mitigation and adaptation are to be discussed in the next report coming in a few months. Now, they also talk generally about energy infrastructure, disaster management, human health, living standards, and more, as you can see in some of these diagrams, and as they relate to our ability to mitigate and adapt to adverse changes as we approach 1.5 degrees of warming globally. Some things are more or less achievable, and the size of these bubbles is proportionate to the overall feasibility today. Some things like forest adaptation are highly feasible, but improving livestock efficiency is not as straightforward. Some parts of this report, I admit, like this graphic, I find a bit wonky to interpret, but impressive nonetheless that all these parameters have been considered. And on this chart, there are some pretty lofty sustainable development goals. These are the goals all 195 UN nation states agreed to prioritize, which are organized on this axis here. And we can see how changes and responses to ecosystems, energy, city planning, etc. affects our ability to achieve these goals with varying degrees of confidence and causality. Now, they summarize all these measures with the term climate resilient development. Evidence of observed impacts, projected risks, levels and trends of vulnerability, and adaptation limits demonstrate that worldwide climate resilient development action is more urgent than previously assessed in AR5, which was the last series of reports. Comprehensive, effective, and innovative responses can harness synergies and reduce trade-offs between adaptation and mitigation to advance sustainable development with very high confidence. They go one step further. They say climate resilient development is enabled when governments, civil society, and the private sector make inclusive development choices that prioritize risk reduction, equity, and justice, and when decision-making processes, finance, and actions are integrated across governance levels, sectors, and timeframes with very high confidence. So in sum, we need to get our shit together. Overall, this is a fascinating report, and I recommend that you read it, because even more than the first report, it gets at the effects of climate change that impact our lives directly. And I'll link down to the summary below and some other helpful video links if you want to get more details. But suffice to say that most of what the first report says is still true in the second iteration. We need to stay under 1.5 degrees centigrade of global mean temperature rise. We have about 10 years to do it, and we need to start adapting to a changing world now. We shouldn't need the threat of nuclear war or a global pandemic to get us to act, but let's not squander this opportunity. The authors admit that even today, given the failure of action to date, with very high confidence, achieving climate resilient development will not be easy. Now, some of you might be thinking, yeah, big whoop, we've known all this. We know the earth is boiling, we've known for a long time, but what can we really do about it? Well, ladies and gents, I hear you. Now, I don't have all the answers, but much of what I talk about on this channel are ways that you can lessen your own personal environmental footprint, like today, like right now. I invite you to explore some other videos if you want to start composting or even buy more sustainable cleaning supplies. Perhaps recent gas prices are causing you to consider an EV or a hybrid. Well, check out my EV buyer's guide up here. But what really matters is large-scale national and international paradigm shifts, and some of those recommendations are still coming. That's what the next installment from Working Group 3 will be all about. So sit tight and be patient. And thank you so much for watching. And please like, share, and subscribe, as you should do if you made it this far. Congratulations. And thanks again. I'll see you in the next video. Have a good one.